With so many releases of new GPUs and price cuts seemingly happening on a weekly basis, things are really starting to heat up in the kind of GPU space. And with AMD having one of the best value for money products in the segment in the form of the 7800 XT, they actually have one card that never saw the light of day past Asia. I'm talking about the 7900 GRE, or Golden Rabbit Edition, which is now setting its sights on the Western world. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So the 7900 GRE Golden Rabbit Edition is an odd one. Firstly, the naming. Last year was the year of the rabbit, and in Chinese culture, that stuff is taken very seriously. So while some may love the name, others are, well, they're going to hate it. But we're going to refer to it as the GRE. Now, what the card is, for those out of the loop, is a card that sits between the 7800 XT and 7900 XT, and is also a bit of a weird one. Firstly, it's based on Navi 31 like the 7900 XT, but beyond that, it's cut down in every single way, including less memory, a smaller bus, less bandwidth, and fewer cores. But you would expect that given the $549 price tag that it comes in at. But then things start to get, well, really weird. Not only does it include the same 16GB GDDR6 that the 7800 XT comes with, but it's also on the same 256-bit bus. But the throughput is actually less at 576GB per second compared to 624 on the 7800 XT. And then the strangest thing, albeit we're talking 3 watts, but the 7900 GRE has a TDP of 260 watts, compared to 263 on the lower end 7800 XT, and quite a drop from the 300 watts on the 7900 XT. So it's almost like certain things were an afterthought, and while AMD will market this as a special edition card, it comes across more like a bin 7900 XT that just didn't quite make the cut. And based on those weird specs, it almost feels like, I don't know, the 7800 XTX may have been the better marketing choice for naming the card. So what about the pricing? Well, that's where things get interesting, as when the GRE launched in Asia, the converted price came out about $650. But with the launch in the Western market, it's actually launching for $549. Now, we do have one model of the card here in the form of the Sapphire Nitro Plus, which is a SKU that commands a premium over a reference spec, and therefore this actually comes in at $599. Which in all honesty, based on other Nitro cards we've looked at in the past, I can honestly say it's worth the extra premium. Now, as we all know, even highly overclocked models only offer up a small margin of error difference in performance, and the extra cost involved is more in regards to the cooler, the design, and the overall cooling performance, and that's where the extra money goes. So, let's talk about the card. Now, I've always been a fan of Sapphire cards, and that's not to say I'm a fanboy who can't appreciate other brands, far from it. But I've always loved the way Sapphire design their cards, as they've always looked and felt like a premium quality product. And that's certainly true with the new 7900 GRE. It's a very simple and clean design with no obnoxious branding or RGB lighting on this side, instead favouring a very sleek looking shroud, with the fans being, I guess, the most outlandish thing on here. There are 3 fans on the card which come with some really unique looking fan blades that have an aggressive look to them thanks to a sharp angular design to each of the 9 blades. I personally think it makes them look like alloy wheels of a supercar, which again, I approve of. Now, the card is pretty minimal on the sides too, and while the fans do look aggressive and sharp, the edges and corners of the cards are rounded off and they look, well, smooth. There's a plate on the side with the Radeon logo behind it and a large RGB bar. While it's quite, let's say, in your face, it is actually done really, really well and not as, let's say, gamery as we see from other brands. There's also some ventilation on the sides of the card too, allowing heat to easily exhaust from all sides. And there's even a built-in metal brace that will help prevent flexing and sag throughout the card. Being an AMD card, there's still no 12V PWR connector, so it makes do with a pair of 8-pin PCIe connectors, which I suppose is good news for those of you without a newer PSU design. Now, next to the power connectors, there's also a set of ARGB pins so you can sync the lighting with other hardware if you wish. There's a chunky full metal backplate on the Sapphire RX 7900 GRE, finished in a kind of slightly bluish, kind of gun-looking metal colour, and it's riddled with large holes on the back and the side, but also some smaller ventilation holes, ensuring heat can be exhausted and doesn't build up behind the PCB. Now towards the back of the card there's a fan-in connector allowing you to hook up an external fan. This is especially handy as you can have the GPU control a fan in the front of your PC case, allowing the card to effectively request more airflow rather than just running its own fans harder to improve the cooling. As we tear down the card, you can see that it comes with 16GB of memory with 8 memory ICs surrounding the AMD Navi 31 GPU core. The memory uses a 256-bit memory bus rather than the 320-bit interface used on the previous 20GB models that we've seen on this chipset, but does come in slightly slower than the other lower-end models like the 7800 XT. The power hardware is also noticeably robust, so it makes sense to see the more premium Nitro Plus cooling solution here to keep it all under control. The cooler comes with a vapour chamber design, thick heat pipes, and feeds into a pretty heavy and dense radiator design, which combined with those 3 large fans should make pretty light work of keeping this card running at its best. So a very nice looking card, and a cooler that should be more than capable of keeping the GPU under control. But the big question comes down to how it performs. To test, we put the card onto our GPU test bench consisting of an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D sitting in a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 dual channel memory. All testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates applied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboard we used. We also used AMD's latest driver and we tested 14 games in total. We'll be taking a look at 1440p and 4K today because that's really where the main focus for this card is, before taking a look at the overall averages, and we've actually been testing it in 40 games in total and we'll be putting the charts for them up on our Patreon, along with the 1080p charts as well. The link for that is down below. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So kicking things off with a Plague Tale Requiem at 1440p where the 7900 GRE comes in at 78 FPS, which puts it about 10% faster than the 7800 XT. In comparison to its bigger brother the 7900 XT, it does come in around 15% slower, but does end up beating the 4070 Super by 5%, which considering it's $50 cheaper means that the GRE is off to a reasonably good start. As we move up to 4K, performance takes a hit of 44 FPS, but we're at a pretty demanding level now, where even the likes of the 7900 XT fails to hit 60 FPS. This means that the GRE comes in 17% slower, but now matches the performance of the 3080 Ti, which also means that it's 10% faster than the 7800 XT, and again just edges ahead of the more expensive RTX 4070 Super. In Baldur's Gate 3 at 1440p, the GRE comes in with a respectable 132 FPS, which now puts it 13% ahead of the 7800 XT and matches the performance of the RTX 3090 from last generation, which also puts it 14% behind the 7900 XT, which is pretty good considering the 7900 XT comes in 35% more expensive. So arguably you're getting better performance for your money here, especially as the GRE comes in 6% faster than the 4070 Super from Nvidia, which is $50 more expensive to buy. At 4K we still see more than playable performance at 75 FPS, which now comes in identically to the RTX 3080, though that does see slightly better low figures, which does seem to penalise AMD in this game. The GRE now comes in 16% slower than the 7900 XT, so again, better value overall, and pushes 10% ahead of the 7800 XT. The 4070 Super does play a bit more of a catch up at 4K, but the 7900 GRE still sits 4% faster overall. Moving over to Call of Duty at 1440p and we're now hitting 169 frames per second. This puts it 2% faster than the 4080 Super, though COD is known to favour AMD, so take from that what you will. This also inflates things against the 4070 Ti Super where the GRE comes in 20% faster, but what this means for apples to apples comparisons is that the GRE is 14% faster than the 7800 XT and falls just 7% behind the 7900 XT, so some pretty impressive numbers for the price. Going up the ranks to 4K, and while we see a performance drop to 101 FPS, that still means we're only 8% slower than the 7900 XT and 6% slower than the 4080 Super, which has found some extra performance. We're now also seeing 17% faster performance than the more expensive 4070 Ti and in the same realms of performance as the RTX 4080 non-Super, which is quite an achievement, but as I say, this game does favour AMD quite heavily. Cyberpunk gives good performance that sits just below the 4070 Ti Super at 95 FPS. The 7900 XT has a bit more performance in this game, and the GRE now sits 14% slower, but that still puts it 8% faster than the 7800 XT, which comes in $100 cheaper. What's more interesting here is how the 7900 GRE packs 14% more performance over a 4070 Super, which is the more expensive of these cards. 4K sees all cards take a hammering, and while we're on the limits of playable performance at 40 FPS, the dips in the more intensive areas could lead to a not so pleasant experience. Regardless, it puts it on par with the 4070 Ti and trails only 1 FPS behind the 4070 Ti Super. Impressively, it approaches the performance levels of both the 3080 Ti and the 3080 12GB, both of which were much more expensive when they launched. Compared to the 7900 XT, the GRE demonstrates an 18% decrease in performance, yet it does maintain a slight edge over the 7800 XT by 5%, showcasing its competitive positioning in its respective price bracket. Turning ray tracing on and dropping back down to 1440p sees the GRE coming 11% behind the 7900 XT. However, it outpaces the 7800 XT by 15%, but for 20% more money. So is it really worth it overall? In comparison to Nvidia, the GRE does lag by 27% when compared to the 4070 Super and 14% when compared to the 4070 non-Super, which was expected as Nvidia typically have the upper hand in terms of RT performance. At 4K, unless you're rocking an RTX 4090, you're going to want to rely on upscaling. Either way, the GRE does come in with a marginal lead of 1 FPS over the 7800 XT, while also sitting 13% behind the more expensive 7900 XT. Again, when compared to what Nvidia have to offer, it's on par with the RTX 4070 non-Super, but the newer 4070 Super pushes it 18% behind. But even then, we're only talking by a few frames per second. In Far Cry 6 at 1440p, the 7900 GRE comes in with a solid frame rate of 187 FPS. It outperforms the RTX 4070 Super by a notable 19%, showcasing its stronger performance for less money. The more expensive RTX 4070 Ti Super narrowly edges past the GRE by a marginal 1%, but that doesn't really account for much considering the inflated price. In contrast, the 7900 XT showcases its higher tier performance by 17%, while the 7800 XT sits 4% behind the latest GPU from AMD. At 4K, the 7900 GRE comes in with a respectable 103 FPS, which puts it at the same levels of performance as the RTX 3090, 7800 XT, 3080 Ti and 4070 Ti, with the most interesting results there being the 7800 XT, which even though it has the same 16GB of GDDR6 on a 256-bit bus, actually has higher bandwidth than the 7900 GRE. Beyond that, the 7900 XT, which is more expensive, does also come in with 26% more performance overall, while the 4070 Super, which is also more expensive, comes in with 8% less performance. Enabling ray tracing at 1440p, both the 7900 GRE and the RTX 4070 Super deliver an identical frame rate of 137 FPS, though the GRE comes in with, say, slightly stronger low figures. Now, the performance on the GRE is also extremely close to the 3090 Ti, which is only around 2% faster overall, while the more expensive 7900 XT comes in 16% faster, while the cheaper 7800 XT falls just 4% behind, so pretty competitive performance overall. At 4K, the 7900 GRE, RTX 4070 Super, the 3080 12GB and the 7800 XT all deliver similar frame rates of around 82 FPS, showing that the 7900 GRE is more than enough to take on the more expensive Nvidia card in ray tracing performance, at least in this game. Compared to its bigger brother, the 7900 XT, the GRE sits 18% behind, which is also pretty respectable given its price point against the higher tiered card. Moving over to Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p, the 7900 GRE comes in at 98 FPS, which is on par with the RTX 3090 and only 4% behind the more expensive 4070 Ti Super. In comparison to the 7900 XT, the newest card from AMD comes in 19% slower, while in comparison to the 7800 XT, the GRE packs another 8% more performance while beating the 4070 Super by the same 8% margin. At 4K, performance on this card matches the 4070 Ti non-Super at 50 frames per second, which is a modest 9% ahead of the 7800 XT, and now places the Golden Rabbit card 19% behind the bigger 7900 XT, which comes in 34% more expensive. So price to performance favours the newer GPU from Team Red, even if upscaling would be needed to get over that 60 FPS threshold that most gamers crave. Enabling ray tracing at 1440p only sees the GRE pack another 5% more performance over the 7800 XT, now at 37 FPS. This also means that Nvidia take the win with the RTX 4070 with an 11% margin, and the 4070 Super, which comes in 38% faster, is only $50 more. But that was expected considering we're looking at ray tracing performance where AMD typically fall behind Nvidia anyway. Moving up to 4K, and the GRE comes in at 22 FPS, which funnily enough comes in slightly ahead of a 7900 XT. Testing both cards repeatedly just garnered the same results within margin of error, and it just seems like AMD ran out of steam in this game. And short of turning upscaling on, the RTX 4090 really is the only card that will give a somewhat playable experience. But even then, the lows will cause the gameplay to suffer regardless. In Spider-Man, the 7900 GRE comes in 10% ahead of the cheaper 7800 XT and 12% behind the 7900 XT, putting it perfectly between these two cards, though we'll see how that reflects based on the cost per frame very shortly. Nvidia still manages to keep the upper hand with both the RTX 4070, which comes in at the same $549 price tag, and the 4070 Super, which commands an extra $50 on top, for 7% more performance. At 4K, the 7900 GRE comes in identically in both the averages and 1% lows as the 6950 XT, which while it sounds good, it's not much of a leap from generation to generation for some people. The more expensive 4070 Super still comes in 8% faster for 9% more money, which is a fair assessment, while in comparison to the 7800 XT, the GRE has 10% more performance overall, so not bad. In ray trace performance, the GRE sits at the same levels of performance as the RTX 4070, which also matches it price for price. The 7900 GRE also packs another 18% more performance over the cheaper 7800 XT and only sits 12% behind the 7900 XT, which is pretty good considering the price disparity between the two cards. At 4K, the 7900 GRE falls just below 60 FPS, but still manages to sit 2 frames ahead of the RTX 4070. The newer 4070 Super improves upon that with 13% more performance for just $50 more, but again, we're talking ray tracing performance, so that's expected regardless. In Ratchet and Clank at 1440p, the 7900 GRE, 4070 Super and 7800 XT all delivered closely matched frame rates, with the GRE coming out on top at 126 FPS. While it's good, 4 FPS isn't much of a jump from the 7800 XT, but the GRE does still pack a bit of a punch in the grand scheme of things as it only sits 14% behind the bigger, badder 7900 XT. At 4K, both the 7900 GRE and 4070 Super demonstrate similar performance separated by just 2 FPS, and the same when comparing the 7900 GRE and the 7800 XT. Again, 2 FPS, but $100 difference in price. It's a weird move from AMD, but this is only one game, and the overall averages may paint a different picture across all of the games. In ray tracing, the 7900 GRE and 7800 XT closely match in performance, with the GRE taking the slight edge by a single frame per second. Again, not really offering up any extra value. As expected, Nvidia take the win with the 4070 Super, but the even worse news for AMD is how the 4060 Ti comes in 8% faster and for a much cheaper price. Moving up to 4K, a lot of the cards tank quite heavily, including the 7900 GRE, which drops to 20 FPS, which puts it 122% faster than the 7800 XT, which sounds amazing, but we're only talking 11 FPS. But where the numbers are so low, yeah, it looks inflated. Beyond that, there isn't really much else to say, because without upscaling, unless you're prepared to spend a lot more money, things aren't going to be great in terms of the overall gameplay experience. Lastly, in Starfield at 1440p, the 7900 GRE leads the 4070 Super by a 6% margin and the 7800 XT by a slightly higher 7%, with a respectable 90 frames per second. It shows some strong performance, which puts the GRE 17% behind the more expensive 7900 XT and looks to offer much better value than Nvidia's counterparts. Then, finally, at 4K, the 7900 GRE comes in at 57 FPS, which matches the performance of the 6950 XT and pushes 8% more performance than the 7800 XT, and 10% more than the slightly higher priced 4070 Super. So in the price war of around $600, there's definitely some strong competition with this new card. So some interesting numbers. There's games where the 7900 GRE holds a strong lead over the 7800 XT and doesn't fall that far behind the 7900 XT in some cases. There are other games where the performance between the 7800 XT and 7900 GRE is much closer. And this just shows the card in a different light considering the extra price premium over the 7800 XT. Now, talking about price, though the card we have is $50 more expensive, we are using the MSRP launch price because, as I mentioned, the extra cost doesn't lend itself to too much more performance, if any, and we are talking margin of error anyway. It's here where at 1440p, the 7900 GRE doesn't fare that well, coming in at $6.18 per frame, which puts it between the RTX 4060 Ti and RTX 3070. This also means that it's 19 cents per frame more than the more expensive 7900 XT at its recently reduced $739 price tag. In comparison to the cheaper 7800 XT, that's still the best value GPU from both AMD and Nvidia at $5.08 per frame, which puts it just over $1 per frame cheaper. There's always the argument that the 7800 XT is firmly aimed at 1440p gamers, while the 7900 GRE is more aimed at both 1440 and 4K, so it may do better at the higher resolution, though I'm not hopeful. What's also worth noting is that the RTX 4070 Super comes in 48 cents cheaper per frame and arguably gives more functionality and better performance in ray tracing titles, and with a big focus on upscaling that AMD is still behind on, yeah, it kind of creates a bit more of a tricky argument. It will cost you more money, but an MSRP 4070 Super like the FE from Nvidia actually comes in at the same $599 price tag as the Nitro model we have here today, so I guess you could say they are both comparatively priced. As we move up to 4K, as expected, nothing really changes. The 7900 GRE now comes in at $14.93 per frame, which puts it more expensive than both the 7900 XT and 7800 XT, as we saw at 1440p. Again, Nvidia's 4070 Super is thrown into the mix and does come in $1.18 per frame cheaper, and again creates quite a tricky argument depending on your needs, especially as the overall average FPS is identical on those two cards. Even at the higher resolution, it's still very clear to see that the 7800 XT, which also is only separated by a few frames per second, is the better buy due to its aggressive price point, even if it does fall short in quite a few games at the higher resolution. So some pretty clear indications that the 7900 GRE is overall a pretty good value for money product, but AMD's own cards just knock it down a peg or two. And while Nvidia are of similar value in that kind of proposition, we're only talking about one card with the rest of the Nvidia stack coming in much more expensive. But I guess that's a given, as Nvidia are typically more expensive, but do also give more features and more functionality. Now the other thing we need to look at is thermal and cooling performance. It's here where we find the GPU temperature sitting around a fairly reasonable 73 degrees throughout the test, with the hotspot coming in a little higher at a kind of around 81 degrees. When we look at the memory junction temperature, we see a higher but still manageable 92 degrees, whilst the clock speed sat below its rated speed at around 2200 MHz. Though when we first started the run, we were seeing above 2400 MHz, but those temperatures must just be forcing it down ever so slightly. The power usage of the card remained at around 285 watts throughout the test, all while the fans barely span up at around 1000 RPM throughout, meaning the card stayed a reasonable temperature while being barely audible. Though, for me personally, I would have liked to have seen maybe a slightly higher fan speed and then temperatures more under control, and maybe then the boost speed would have just sorted itself out a little bit. Now, I'm more than aware that this card has technically been out on the market for around 7 months, but as it was only available in Asia, it was only fair that we took a look, ourselves, and I'm actually glad that we did. The issue with any GPU generation is releasing models that can hit all of the major price points, and to also be competitive on a performance level, especially when compared to the competition. Now AMD, until now, had the 7800 XT at $499 and the 7900 XT at $899 when it launched. And while that has seen price cuts down to $739, I don't know, it's quite a big gap of over $200. Now, if the GRE had launched in Western markets for the originally proposed $649, I would simply say it's just not worth it, as it's too close to the pricing now of the 7900 XT, and that probably wouldn't have seen price cuts. But at $549, it's much more palatable, but comes with its own issues of now being so close to the 7800 XT, which offers up a much more favourable argument in terms of value. Now, the GRE is an odd one though, especially given the TDP and the slower memory bandwidth when compared to its little brother, and that is partly, I guess, its downfall. But if the TDP was higher, say to 300 watts, and the memory bandwidth was increased slightly, then we'd likely see performance closer to the 7900 XT, which would then make that particular card redundant. Now, these are all reasons that I can look at, and I can see why AMD have done what they've done, and having something that can compete with the likes of the 4070 Super is a wise choice, because the 7800 XT just falls short in comparison for overall performance. but I guess more than makes up for it in terms of cost. Now, if I was in the market for a new GPU, I'd honestly still be looking at the 7800 XT. But if I had more money to spare, then the GRE makes sense without going too crazy and pushing your budget up to 7900 XT territory. But on the same hand, Nvidia have the 4070 Super that competes, and in ray tracing and other functionality and features, it is the clear winner. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is really it comes down to what's right for you. If it is, let's say, pure rasterization, then there's a big argument. But I fear that budget and what you as an individual are willing to spend is going to be the biggest decision you'll have to make. So yeah, for now, that's going to do it for this one. Let me know, is the 7900 GRE Golden Rabbit Edition, whatever you want to call it, a card that you'd consider buying? Or have AMD just muddied the stack a bit too much now? Let us know in the comment section below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then consider supporting us over on Patreon. You'll help the channel out like you wouldn't believe, along with getting some really cool perks like access to more charts and testing data, bi-weekly game nights, a super special area on our Discord, and much, much more. The link for all that great stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.